My name is Johan Weitz. I work for Europeana. I've been introduced by Isabel already. Part of my job at Europeana is being a project manager for wonderful projects like Crafted that you saw a bit about in the last session. But I also do API outreach, which basically is a fancy term for saying that I teach people about what APIs are, what our Europeana APIs are, and I basically want to evangelize the gospel of how important it is to know about APIs, not only as a researcher or a developer, but also as an educator and as a student. So Elizabeth has very graciously given me 3 hours with you to talk about APIs, which is wild. So if you have any questions, if there's anything you want to talk about, we have more than enough time. The first hour will be today, and then we have 2 other hours tomorrow. So we'll start with session 1. What the heck is an API and why is it important? So if you already know what an API is, there will be a little bit of repetition of that knowledge, which is never bad. But also if you have any questions about things that I say during the session, feel free to just shout them at me. So let's get into the thick of things. What is an API? In short, API stands for Application Programming Interface. This means nothing if you don't know. These are just words. So I do want you to remember them for now because I will come back to them in a bit and hopefully you'll then understand what these 3 words mean. So just remember Application Programming Interface, API. To understand what an API is, we first have to talk a little bit about how the internet works in general or how websites work in general. So whenever you go to a website, whenever you go to Facebook, things are presented to you in a human readable format, right? You go to Twitter and you understand, okay, I have a feed with posts, with people's thumbnails. Okay, great. All of this information that you're seeing on Twitter, the tweets themselves, these thumbnails, these titles, they come from some kind of database in the back end of that website. Databases are mostly just fancy spreadsheets, fancy Excel sheets. All of the internet is mostly built on spreadsheets in some way or another. And to present you this data in a nice way, there is some code in between that makes things pretty. So CSS and HTML are the coding languages used to make things visible and readable for humans. But the real magic happens here in JavaScript or sometimes some other coding languages that take that data from the database, from that spreadsheet, and put them in front of your eyes in a way that you can understand it. This step is pretty hard because spreadsheets are very messy. You have to get information from different places that are maybe formatted or put in different CSVs and databases at the same time. So a lot of energy and time is spent translating what is in the database to something human readable. Luckily, we have something that helps with that, and those are APIs. APIs are basically kind of little helper programs, little helper websites that allow you to interact with a database in a reliable and interoperable and recognizable way, so that every time you interact with that database, you don't need to know exactly what that whole spreadsheet looks like, what is in which field, what is in which spreadsheet. You just need to know how the API works a little bit, read some documentation, and then you can get that data very easily onto your website. A lot of websites use APIs for their own databases, but one of the great things about APIs is that they are online. They are accessible through your browser or through the internet. So that means that you can connect to other people's APIs and use other people's data for your own program, for your own application. So you can not only take your own data, but also integrate data from other places. And that really is the power of an API in and of itself. I'm representing APIs with these little blocks here, which doesn't really explain how the heck they work or what they actually are. So let's look at an example. I'm going to go over here. I have an example from Reddit, which is a website you may or may not know. It is it's called the front page of the internet. It's basically a place with a lot of forums where people can discuss several things. It is a kind of social media platform like Facebook. So the example I have here is from a subreddit called Jokes, where people tell jokes to each other. Great, easy to use. The subreddit works in one way. You have a website that shows you what Reddit you are on. We are on the Jokes subreddit. This joke has a title. What's the one thing you shouldn't say? Well, yes, I am 18, luckily. One second. Okay, I will just show you on this, which is basically the same but a bit smaller. The title says, what is one thing you shouldn't say at your boss's funeral? And that title has some text, and the text is, who's thinking outside of the box now, Kyle? So that's the joke. It has a title and it has some text. I think that's why I had to confirm that I was 18 or older for this kind of joke. Now, one of the nice things here is that you can read it and you can understand it as a human, but in the back end of this, down a little bit. If we take this URL and we add .json after it, we will actually look at the API that sits behind Reddit and look at what the data looks like that has created this joke webpage. This is a bit harder to read for humans because it's not meant to read for humans, but this has all of the same information that we just saw on this joke subreddit. So if we look through some of the fields, you might see there's a value called self-text here, and then it says, who's thinking outside of the box now, Kyle? Right, that was the punchline. We have a title field. What's one thing you shouldn't say at your boss's funeral? We're in the subreddit Our Jokes. So all of the same data that we just saw is available here, but in a structured format so that if you are a developer creating some kind of application, you can connect to this website, which in and of itself is just also a website, but it's structured in a way that if you are creating some piece of code or some program, you can always tell that program the title will always be in this field called title. The text of the joke will always be in the field called self-text. Subreddit will always be in the field called subreddit. So this data is structured in a very reliable and predictable way. And this is a huge boon for developers that might not be familiar with what the Reddit database looks like in the backend, but they know how the API works. So they can use their knowledge of that API to create other apps without ever having to email a Reddit developer and ask them, please help me out to create my own program on top of Reddit data. So that's one example. Let's look at some others. Further, can I see this now? No. Okay, great. Good. So to show you an example of how you can build things on top of an API, let's look at a different API. We're going to stay with the joke idea and look at this very simple API called Official Joke API. If you go to this API, this gives you some very, very basic information, right? This is the API. It says, try random joke, and then some other ideas. So it is telling us what the different methods are for using this API. So if I then go to this URL and I add the information that it wants me to add, like random joke. This is actually a random joke, so I don't know if it will be a good one or not. Nice. It again gives me some data in JSON format. So this one has a joke type general. The setup is, what's the difference between an African elephant and an Indian elephant? And the punchline is about 5,000 miles. Not the best joke, but okay, it works. If a developer would want to take this, it has some very basic information to work with, and it can build whatever he wants or she wants on top of this API. They could, for instance, make a very simple phone app that takes that data and puts it in a little widget that, for instance, every day it would give you a random joke. Or here it has created a widget that has one button called random joke. And if you click that button, it would basically send a request to that API to the URL that we just visited called random joke. It would say that setup field, put it in here, and the punchline field, put it in here. And so we have another joke on this phone. So this was kind of to show you how developers can use APIs to create their own programs or apps. Moving on, why are APIs important to know about if you're not a developer, if you don't want to create your own app Why should we learn about APIs in and of itself? There's several reasons. The first of them is that it really makes you understand how different websites or platforms that you use every day work together and why and how they work. So to give you some examples of things you probably use every day that use an APIs is when you're searching things on Google or on another search engine. So if you're looking for the weather, I put in a Google search for weather Antwerp here, and we get a result. This isn't because Google has a bunch of weather scientists that are creating the weather every day and sending it to Google itself. This is actually coming from an API that Google uses. So at the bottom right of this, you'll see that this says weather.com, which is the source website that they get their information from. They will connect to the API from weather.com. It will give you some information back, and they then present it in a nice view to show you that it's going to be quite sunny today. This is from a while ago. It's not as cold, luckily, today in Antwerp. Another way APIs are used is when you're logging in using a social media login on another website. If you're on Etsy, for instance, and you want to log in, you can log in using Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, any other kind of platform. The upside of this for a website like Etsy is that they don't have to develop their own user login interface. They don't have to keep their own database of users and passwords. They can just say, you know, let's let Google do this. And this is nice for Google because that means that people that have an account at Google have a lot more use for their account. They only need to create one account, and then they can log into thousands of websites at the same time. Same happens with payments. Once you are on Etsy and you want to buy a nice hand-knit sweater, for instance, you can use PayPal or MasterCard or any other payment solution that they offer. And again, Etsy doesn't have to develop their own banking infrastructure. They can send you to PayPal, which makes it really easy for both the user and the people who are programming things. Right. Going back to these three words, application programming interface, you might still not understand it, but an API is an interface that helps you program an application. That's what application programming interface is. We saw some interfaces today of APIs that structure data in a really nice and well-structured way. So this can help you program your application. Application programming interface. I hope you don't forget it ever now. What I do want you to remember more than this acronym and what it stands for, you know, knowing that acronym might be nice in a quiz, but the actual information I want you to remember is that an API is like a website for computers. It makes things computer readable, and it makes access to databases easy, reliable, and interoperable. Getting to the crux of why APIs are important for everyone to learn about, I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent together, so bear with me. As we know now, APIs make internet applications and programs work together. That is really great if you want to create new programs without having to create your own data or your own databases. So a few nice examples are Twitter bots, which are really easy to make. This Twitter bot on the left is called Emoji Mashup Bot. It connects the Emojipedia API, which is like Wikipedia but for emojis, and Twitter. And what it does is it tweets a new emoji that is mashing up two existing emojis. So this top one is the kissing cat emoji and the winking emoji mashed up into a new emoji, and then it tweets that. A human didn't make this. This was done by a bot that connects several APIs together. APIs can also help existing programs become better, add new features and functionalities that don't exist there before. If you do any social media marketing or communications, you might know of an application called Hootsuite, which is basically a program that allows you to work with a lot of different social media apps at the same time. So you could schedule a LinkedIn post and a Twitter post and a Facebook post and an Instagram post all at the same time from the same application, and it connects to all of their APIs to post it for you. So it's this kind of nice dashboard that you as a marketing manager or a social media manager can use instead of having all of these different programs open. And that can only be done because all of these platforms have their own API. We looked at Reddit before. Reddit has a lot of apps that are not created by Reddit, but that people use to browse Reddit by themselves. So one of them is Apollo. It adds a lot of new features and functionalities that the Reddit developers themselves didn't make, but that you can now access because another developer has said, well, I actually don't really like all of the features that Reddit has. I want these other features. I'm just going to create my own app on top of Reddit, use their database, use their API, and millions of people use Apollo instead of the developer-created Reddit app. So that creates this kind of community of working together towards the same goals with the same databases and the same APIs, without them being in competition or fighting each other. And this kind of open knowledge network where anyone who wants to create something on top of a database that already exists is made possible with an API. Talking about APIs is very current because a lot is happening these days around APIs and free access and open access. One of the big things that happened a few years ago that I'm sure you all know about is that we as a society kind of realized that social media doesn't always have our best interests at heart. At the time when Facebook, when we all discovered that Facebook was selling our data to third-party apps, they were influencing elections using our user data, and we're selling it for a lot of money. We suddenly realized, wow, okay, maybe these platforms aren't really just for us to communicate with each other, but there's actually a commercial involvement in being on social media platforms. A lot of us moved from WhatsApp to Signal or Telegram a few years ago because of these data leaks and people collecting our data together. And so the possibility that APIs would give us in that moment is that we are not locked into the platform that we already have been on for the past few years, right? If you've been on Facebook for 10 or 15 years and suddenly you realize, well, actually, I don't like this platform anymore, I want to go somewhere else, an API should allow you to go from one platform to another while taking all of your data and all of your information with you. That's, of course, not in the best interest of these big companies themselves, Facebook and Instagram, Apple, and Twitter. They don't want you to leave their platform. So in the past few years, a lot of these big platforms have started closing down their APIs and closing down access to their databases for other developers and for other third-party apps. So very recently, Twitter shut off its free API capabilities, making it so that all of these bots and other implementations that were using the Twitter API stopped working, or they started, they had to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to keep using their databases. Reddit itself has now gone public. They're on the stock market, so they want to make sure that everyone stays on their platform and doesn't use third-party platforms. So they are now also shutting down their free API access, which makes it really hard for people like the developers of Apollo or other third-party apps to keep on developing their programs. And this really is a kind of pivotal moment in the open source movement, where we see that a lot of these big platforms that people have bought into over the past few years because they were the best platforms to be on, all of our friends were on those platforms, we're suddenly seeing that we're becoming locked into those platforms, that it's becoming really hard to go to something else that has a different view, different features than what we would like. So the emoji mashup bot that we just saw had to close down a few months ago. This was the last emoji they created. And the Apollo Reddit app has had to close down, I think, since today officially, because their free API access had been closed down as well. So knowing this really is a very important part of realizing what you are actually buying into when you are signing up for an application, when you're using some kind of software. There's a really good article by Cory Doctorow that is titled "As Platforms Decay, Let's Put Users First." The platforms they're talking about are platforms like Facebook that we have seen have become a lot worse and a lot harder to use over the past few years. And it's become really hard to not be on that platform and move to a different one, because we see that those platforms are not putting us first anymore. They're putting their shareholders, they're putting the selling of our data first. And this is a bit of a kind of crisis in the open source world currently. There are other alternatives that try to be as open as they can and give possibilities to people that want to build on their own databases in the way that I just talked about. So one option that is kind of blowing up recently is called ActivityPub. This is a kind of protocol that is completely open, very basic, and it allows you to send and receive messages from friends to other friends, which is a very easy and simple protocol to use, but a lot of open sourced third-party apps have been built on this. So you might have heard of some alternatives to the big kind of social media apps that we've been using. There's Mastodon in there, there's PixelFed, Lemmy, and other open source decentralized apps that can all interact with each other in the way that we would actually want these apps to interact with each other, and give us the possibility not only to try these out, create our own account, see how this works, but it also gives us the possibility that if we don't like this new platform that we're on, we can migrate from one platform to another and take all of our data, all of our information with us to a different platform without us being locked in to that platform, because they have open APIs. So one of the kind of lovely new features that exist in this, it's called the Fediverse because it's a universe of federated apps, is that if you are on one of those apps, you can actually see posts from people that are on different apps, which is wild to think about, that it would be possible. For instance, if you're on Instagram, you might be able to see Twitter posts or Facebook posts from other apps in your same feed, which of course now is impossible because Facebook doesn't want people from Instagram showing you their posts and kind of impinging on their app. But if you are on Mastodon, which is kind of the new Twitter in the federated world, you can see posts from people posting on the federated version of Instagram or the federated version of YouTube. And all of that is coming into the same decentralized network, which is all powered by APIs kind of interacting with each other. So underlying this idea is that we're now in a world where everything is centralized, where everything is locked into one platform, while we would want to go to a world where everything can be decentralized, where we have more power over our own data, where people can have sovereignty over the user data that they themselves have. And this is only possible if we have open source APIs interacting with each other. So that was a big tangent on why I think APIs are important. I'm not only telling you this because I think it's important and I want to advocate for it. I also want teachers, educators, students to learn about these possibilities so that they themselves can ask themselves the questions of why am I on a certain platform, of what benefits or downsides is it giving me? If I'm signing up for a TikTok account, am I doing it because all of my friends are on there? And is it giving me the features that I want? Do I really want the algorithm that TikTok is serving me? Or are there alternatives that actually serve my needs better, give me more power over my own account, over my own data, and maybe just treat me in a better way, put me as a user first instead of putting the algorithm or the app first. Right, the kind of furthest step I'll take you is in a kind of decentralized future that hopefully we're working towards, and that's something that Europeana is also very interested in, since there's the data space for cultural heritage that started up last year, where there's a lot of talk about things needing to be decentralized, having this big network of different platforms that are working with each other. And Europeana currently can be seen as one of the centralized platforms for cultural heritage, while actually maybe we would want to go to a world where all these different cultural heritage institutions have their own little platform and can interact with each other. An example of how this has been kind of put forward is a project called the Solid Project, which is created by scientists from Leuven in Belgium, where they basically are creating a protocol where you as a user would have all of your data not only stored locally by yourself, but you would also have it physically. So you would literally have a little box or server that has all of your user data, all your user passwords, all your Facebook posts and Instagram images and YouTube videos, all stored on your own little, physical computer. And that would connect to the internet. And if people would want to see your Facebook post, they wouldn't go to this huge server in the US that has your Facebook posts, but it would go to your little local server that has all of your data with you. So that means that if you say, actually, I don't want anyone to look at my Facebook posts today, you can just unplug your box and then no one has access to it anymore. If you want to say, actually, I only want people in Belgium to look at my Facebook posts today, you can configure your own server so that only people in Belgium in your local community can see your information. So those are the possibilities that a decentralized kind of Web 3.0 would give you. What that does require is a bit of knowledge about how an API would work, because you would basically be having your own database with your own API that you would then show to the rest of this network together. Right. The crux of this is that understanding open source, open APIs, and interoperability will let you make better choices about what apps you use yourself, what software you want to buy into, and how you kind of work with your data in an open universe. So next time that you're on an online platform, hopefully I want you to ask yourself, does this platform have an open API? Can I take all of my data and send it somewhere else? Can I keep it for myself? Can I easily switch platforms if I am on that platform? And if not, why? Why is this platform not allowing me to do this? Are they going to use this for some other means? Are they going to sell it in some way? Why are they not putting me as a user first on this platform? So these kind of questions hopefully can give you a bit more of critical insight into how people are using your data and you yourself work with your data. That was my tangent. I'm going to pause here for questions and comments, if there are any.
I have one.
Go ahead.
Which platform allows that?
This, you mean the
Yes, taking your data with you, if
so,
any.
So the example I gave of the ActivityPub protocol basically has a bunch of different apps that do allow this. So all of the apps that are kind of shown here allow you to do this. So we have Mastodon, which is Instagram in that way. We have PixelFed, which is, no, Mastodon is Twitter, that is decentralized. PixelFed is Instagram, that is decentralized. PeerTube is YouTube, but decentralized. Lemmy is Reddit, but decentralized. Friendica is Facebook, but decentralized. Basically, every social media platform.
They do allow that.
Yes, they do allow it. They do exist. And basically, every social media platform or other platform that you can think of probably already has a decentralized implementation. The big kind of hard step here to go to those different platforms is that, first of all of the people you know, all of your friends are on those big centralized platforms, and being the first one to say, well, no, I'm going to use Mastodon from now on, and I'm not going to use Twitter anymore, might be quite hard because you might not have these connections and this community that you're looking for. And that is exactly why I feel like we should advocate for more of this openness on these centralized platforms as well, so that if you say, well, actually, I'm done with Twitter, I'm going to go to Mastodon, you can also take all of your tweets, all of your followers, all of your friends with you to this new platform, which makes it really easy for you. Currently, of course, this isn't possible. Twitter doesn't want you to know about Mastodon, that it exists even. So that's basically what we're advocating for. Go ahead.
I have a question.
Yes.
You're an average teenager, and okay, a little bit older than a teenager. You were homeschooling during the pandemic, and everyone is, there are big commercials about these platforms, and we are opening up in a closed world, everyone communicating through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. How would you convince your friends to come to something like that? Or maybe another question, how could we as teachers convince teenagers to come to this platform?
Yeah, well, I'd say there's two ways. There's the hard way and the easy way. So the easy way is by showing why those platforms are actually better to use. I don't know if any of you moved from WhatsApp to Signal or Telegram. A lot of us did, and this was kind of a big group move because people really didn't like WhatsApp. It was owned by Facebook, and it was selling your data. So once you say, well, Signal is actually a lot better, it has a lot better features, and it's really easy for us to move, that actually happens quite easily. It happened with Signal. It could happen with things like Twitter as well. The hard way is what I just explained, convincing people that we want to have this open source, these open APIs, you need to understand the technology behind it. This is a really hard sell for a typical, teenager that actually says, well, I just want to post pictures and have my friends see them. If I go to this, then my other friends won't be there, so I'll post pictures into the void, and then no one will see them. So I'd say try the easy way, showing what features are better on these other platforms, and convincing everyone to do this together, even as an experiment, because it's only when moving together that you'll actually keep people on that platform. And the hard way is something that I can do for educators, but maybe not for the basic teenager.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
How much can we control our data? I mean, since our data travel from server to server, and they travel and they change, can we control them from the source, from us? I don't know, because the data travel.
Yes.
They never get lost. As long as you try, even if you delete everything, the data still remain. So how much can we control our own personal data that we create?
Yeah, you mean your personal data that is currently on these big platforms,
Yes.
right? Partly we can't. I mean, they are owned by big corporations. The moment you signed up, you click the I read and accept the terms of agreement, and at that point, that data isn't yours anymore. It's from this company, and it goes through these different servers. We have new laws in place like GDPR that actually tell companies that if we want you to delete our data, it has to be completely gone, not only from this one server, but from all servers that have communicated with it. Some platforms are better at doing this than others. Other platforms like Facebook are getting billions of dollars in fines from the European Union because they cannot do this, or they don't want to do this. But so this is something that partly through legislature and policy, we want to be able to kind of force platforms to do this for us. And on the other hand, I'm afraid that we'll just have to accept that our data will be floating in space for as long as is possible. Even if Facebook deletes all of your user data, it's probably been downloaded by some Russian hackers and put on the dark web already. I'm sorry to tell this to you, but yes, for sure that. Sorry, another question here?
It's similar. What happens if e-banking becomes decentralized? What happens with the credit card information? I mean, is it dangerous?
Okay, well, this is a big topic. I'd say there's as long as we trust protocols that make e-banking safe, then it can be a safe and secure way of doing things. Luckily, in e-banking, there's been a lot of experimentation already going on over the past years for making it decentralized. The whole, cryptocurrency world is doing nothing but that and has been doing nothing but that for the past 5 or 6 years. I'm not saying put everything in cryptocurrency. I don't think that's a good move, but all of these experiments have given us a lot of knowledge and information that can help us create a decentralized banking sphere currently. Platforms like PayPal are already partly decentralized, even though we don't know it. It looks like a big central bank, but actually it is a decentralized way of sending money around already. Very recently, there was a news of the European Union wanting to create their own European coin. I don't know if that's something that you heard, which is a decentralized way of sending money from one place to another. I also don't know if that is a great idea, but the European Union is asking this question and trying to solve it. Yes.
Because you just spoke about European, what can we expect from the EU in terms of legislation rules for as regards data ownership?
Sure. So I feel like we should expect a lot. There's a lot of policy already going on and being discussed that is about allowing platforms to decentralize in a structural way. So the whole data space idea of 12 or 13 data spaces are already the idea that the European Union put forward of decentralizing Europe's digital single market into different platforms. Your question was specifically on what we can expect from the European Union on.
What I have in mind is I'm all for it, but it's a bit techy to go to this side. So can we expect that the EU will make the existing big GAFA better?
That is a good question. I think they will. I think they want to try, but in my mind, this isn't something that will be very productive, right? I think we can ask big platforms to become more decentral, to give us more rights, but in the end, they are still US-based companies under US-based law that will have their own, best interests and their shareholders' interests at heart, which go almost diametrically opposite to the interests that we're just discussing here. So I think funding and supporting new platforms that work better and have new features and use features that we want is a better way to go than try and fight these big corporations. Other questions? Oh, okay, great. Looking at the time. Right. So this first session was basically to give you a very wide view of APIs, software that uses APIs, and why I think it is something that should be taught and learned about because we're moving in the next few years to a world that will have these discussions more and more, as we're already having them today with the Twitter and Reddit examples that I gave. I am going to save myself some time and actually start a little bit with our tomorrow sessions already, just for 10 minutes before we wrap up. We've talked very generally about APIs now. I want to go a little bit more into the technical nitty-gritty of understanding how APIs work with each other. And then tomorrow we will go into museum APIs, cultural heritage APIs, which work a lot differently than the social media APIs that we just discussed. And tomorrow we'll also get some hands-on experience of interacting with these APIs and see what it can do for us. So in this sketch, we have Europeana, and then we have little USB cords going from different platforms to Europeana and from the Europeana platform to other places. These USB cords are the APIs that kind of hold up the Europeana data space together. We have other platforms APIs that we plug into, and our API plugs into other services. The easiest way to explain APIs, which I mostly use when I'm explaining it to students, is that an API is like a socket that you as a program can plug yourself into to get the data from that program into your program. So it connects things together like a USB cable or a plug would do. We've learned about this. This is what I'm going to finish with. An API in and of itself can be anything. It can literally be a website that you send a photo of every day. Because an API in and of itself doesn't have any standards or best practices attached to what it is. So we do have other standards that are developed that we use to create APIs in a way that if a programmer wants to use an API or build an API, they know exactly how to build it. And once you know what one API does, you can start using any API because they all work the same. And this standard that we use is called REST. There have been other standards in the past, but the current standard we use is REST and RESTful APIs. REST doesn't mean anything. It's just the name of the standard. It's not an acronym. And to get a RESTful API, there are basically two things that you have to fulfill that have to be true for your API to be RESTful. The first is that it has to work over HTTP. So it needs to work as a website in your browser. Like we saw, I could just pull up an API in my internet browser. So it needs to work over HTTP. The second is that the RESTful API, air quality index is on okay. I'm going to start breathing a bit less then. The second thing that a RESTful API needs to adhere to is that it needs to have a few methods that are always the same. And these methods are called get, post, put, and delete. I'm not going to go too in depth on them, but get basically means if you send a get method to an API, you're trying to get some information. You're trying to get some data. If you want to see your friend's last Facebook post, you will send a get request to the Facebook API to say, get me that person's Facebook posts, right? Post and put are quite similar. You're sending information to the database, to that API. If you are logging in, for instance, you would send your username and your password to the API. Here is my password. Is it the same as what is in your database? Yes, okay, I'm logged in. And delete speaks for itself. You want to delete your account, you will send a delete request to this REST API, and they will remove your information from the database. So the standard is pretty basic. You get, post/put and delete, and it needs to work over the internet. That is the basic standard that every API works on. I'm telling this to you now because if you ever start working with some API, you will see these terms come back over and over. So knowing what get and post and put basically means will help you along a lot when you are starting to read documentation and use your API for the first time. So how can we access APIs? There's different ways to access APIs. The first, which we already talked about, is just in your browser, but there's also a few other ways. If you ever want to start exploring an API, to me, there's 4 steps that you best follow to be able to use this API in a useful way. First, and the most boring one, is read documentation. I know no one does it, but you really just need to go to the API's website that you want to use, take half an hour, drink a coffee, and just read through the documentation information on that API, because that will tell you exactly how to make calls, how to receive that information, and what the information you're receiving actually means. When we were looking at that Reddit API, it had a lot of fields with a lot of values in it that we didn't understand. If you read the documentation, you will know exactly what each field means and what the value in that field represents. Once you've read some documentation, you need to get authorized for using the API. A lot of APIs are free and open to use and don't need any authorization. I gave the Reddit example because it's a completely open API. Some APIs you would need an API key that is kind of the password that you use to access the APIs, or you would need some authorization information, or you would need to sign up for an account for that API, things like that. So once you get that authorization, you'll be able to use that API. For Europeana's APIs, we have an API key that you need. That's not because we want to steal and sell your data. We do this for our own security because there are sadly people that don't like the European Union and don't like Europeana a lot, and they have malicious intent with our database. Just this week, we had an attack on our Europeana servers where people suddenly start sending millions and millions of requests to our API, trying to shut it down, trying to overwhelm it. So we ask people for an API key so that when these malicious actors try and crash our databases, we can revoke access to the API key and be safe. So that's the only reason why we ask for an API key. Then step 3 is find the endpoint. As I said, an API is basically like a website. So if you want to go to Facebook, you know that the endpoint URL is facebook.com. If you want to use Europeana's API, you need to know that you need to go to api.europeana.eu. So once you have that endpoint, you can start going to that API, making calls, and seeing what comes back. And once you do that, you can start with step 4, making some calls. So different ways to access APIs. Over HTTP, through the browser, like we saw. One of the tips I can give here is that if you start making API calls through your browser, the output might not look as pretty as it does here. This is because I'm using a Chrome plugin that formats the data a little bit nicer. If you don't do that, it might just be a huge garbled response. So in the Padlet, I've put a link to an extension that you can put on Chrome, but these extensions also exist for Firefox and Edge that kind of format this data a bit nicer for you so you can read it a bit better. Other ways, and the way that we will use tomorrow, is using a console or a playground. So a lot of people that are developing programs or developing APIs want people to have very easy access to the API so they can make a few example calls, see what the data looks like, and very easily see how the API works. So to end today, I'm just going to go to the console for Europeana's API with you, and we'll make a sample API call, see how that works, and then we're all set for tomorrow. So this is our Europeana REST API console. Let me get it bigger so I can see. Great. This console gives access to 2 of our APIs. We have our search API, which basically allows you to search our collections in the same way that if you would go to Europeana.eu and you would put in a search, you would get some results back. If you use the search API, it works the exact same way. You put in some search queries, and it gives you back the results of that search. The record API gives you all of the information about a single record. So if you're interested in one object on Europeana, you can give that object ID to the Europeana API, and it will give you back all of the metadata that we have on that single object. So let's look at the search API, because that's the easiest to explain. In this console, you'll have all of the different methods that you can use to access our API. So as I said, we have different get methods here, so you'll get some information from the API. This is for the record API, so I'm going to close that and go to the search API. The search API has 4 methods. We're going to use the easiest method, which is search for records. Quite simple, we're going to search for some records. If we open this up and we click try it out, we will get a kind of, you can see a console as a kind of cockpit with a bunch of buttons that you can press and see what happens when you press those different buttons. All the different parameters that you can set into your API are listed here. Yes, as a nice drop-down. Almost none of these parameters are required to use, but there are always a few parameters that you need to use that aren't optional that you need to use. For the search API, there's 2. You need to put in a query, so we know what you're searching for, and you need to put in your API key. So if it's put in red, like at the bottom here, it's a required parameter. I'm going to put in our demo API key. And if you have requested a key, you can put in your own key here. And then we're going to search for anything. What do we want to search for? Any term.
Food.
Food? Chocolate. Great. We're going to search for chocolate, and we're going to execute our query. This will give us a response. This response tells us how to do things in curl. That's a programming language. We're not going to look at that. But it also gives us a request URL. This is the same website URL that we could put into our browser and surf to in that way. So I could copy and paste this and put this in our browser. Hit enter. And then we will see the API results here. We're going to go back to our console though, because that same response is also visible in the console itself. And so the same way that we saw the response of our Reddit API, this gives us a bunch of fields and values for those fields with our response in it. So if I skip over a few things, we see here that we have total results and then 7,853. So we have a lot of chocolate in Europeana. And then we start having a list of items. So these items are returned as a response to the search. It gives us some information about the first item. It's an item from Italy. It was provided by the Film Library of Bologna. The title is Chocolate Chocolate. For in Italian, it's Cioccolato. And we can keep on going. It gives us a lot of concept information. I'm going to scroll down all the way to the EDM is shown by, which is the field that, if you read the documentation, you would know is the field where we actually store the item itself. So all the rest is metadata, but this is actually the item itself. It seems to be a PDF. So I'm just going to paste it and see where we get. This is a piece of paper from the Ministry of the President, Servizi dello Spettacolo, and there will be, I don't speak Italian, but there will be a presentazione di una scatola di cioccolati fantasia, which sounds amazing. So we found an item in Europeana. This is the first result that we would find when we search chocolate. So if I actually go to our website, Europeana, and search for chocolate, we probably find the same item. There we go. Chocolate Chocolate is our first item on Europeana. If we click on it, this is much more human readable and nice for us to use than this API. I am aware of that. That's why we have the website. And so we can see this item here as well. Lovely. This shows us that not only can we build our website using our database, since our database is completely open, has no paywalls, all of the data that we use is completely free to reuse through our API as well. If you would like to recreate Europeana by yourself tomorrow and create a new website that is better than Europeana, you can. And please do if you want to, or you can create some other apps that use Europeana's data and integrate it. You can use it for research, you can use it for teaching, and how exactly you can do that for those goals, I will explain to you tomorrow, because I've been talking for a full hour. So thank you for sticking with me through this.